My name is Suzanne Shadle. I am the new chief in the Hispanic division here in the Library of Congress. I'd like to welcome the audience and thank you for coming. I would like to say just real quickly a few words about the Hispanic division and about Thalia Guzman Gonzalez, who has organized today's event. So does everybody here know about the Hispanic division and what we do for the most part? So I'll just reiterate, I think this is from me, I think that one of the most important things that we do is that we provide people who help people. And you can see when we're talking about collections that we have collections in many different parts of the Library of Congress. So here today you have rare books, you have general collection, you have prints and photographs, and they all deal to some extent with the topic of our presentation today. And that's brought together by Thalia, who has also brought in community members, academics who are experts in this field. So one of the most important contributions we can make is to bring resources and people and discussions about those resources and topics together. And I'm very grateful to work with Thalia and many others of you in the room to do that kind of work. So I'm going to turn it over to her so she can introduce our speakers. And thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and welcome everyone to this event. On behalf of my colleagues in the Hispanic Division, I would like to welcome you all to the Library of Congress, and especially to this book talk, States of Grace, Utopia in Brazilian Culture, by Patricia Vieira, and that will be moderated by Professor Thayse Lima. I'm going to introduce our speakers, then Professor Vieira will come here and do a short presentation of the book, and then we'll move to the moderated conversation with Professor Lima. There's going to be time for questions, so please, if something comes up, feel free to ask at the end, and hopefully you'll also take advantage of seeing some of the wonderful books that we have here for you today. Patricia Vieira is Associate Professor of Spanish and Portuguese at Georgetown University and Associate Research Professor at the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra. Her fields of expertise are comparative literature, literature and philosophy, literary theory, utopian studies, and environmental studies. She is the author of Seeing Politics Otherwise, Vision in Latin American and Iberian Fiction, Portuguese Film 1930 to 1960, The Staging of the New State Regime, and States of Grace, Utopia in Brazilian Culture, and the co-editor of several books, including Existential Utopia, New Perspectives on Utopian Thought, The Language of Plants, Science, Philosophy, Literature, and The Green Thread, Dialogues with the Vegetal World. She has published numerous academic articles in her fields of expertise, as well as op-eds in the New York Times, the LA Review of Books, and the European, among others. This conversation, like I said, will be moderated by Professor Thayse Lima, who teaches in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Maryland. Her areas of specialization include 19th century to contemporary Brazilian literature and culture, modern Latin American literature and intellectual history, transnationalism, and international literary circulation. She is currently working on a book project that traces the dialogues between Hispanic American and Brazilian cultural and literary critics during the second half of the 20th century, focusing on the efforts to integrate the two distinct literary traditions of Latin America. I would also like to add that Thayse has been here several times to work on her book, and I look forward to seeing you here next soon to present that book here as well. Her articles and book reviews have appeared in journals such as Hispania, Brasil, Literatura de América, and Portuguese Literary and Cultural Studies. Please join me in welcoming both Thayse and Patricia to this presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to, first of all, thank Dr. Thalia Guzman and the Hispanic Division for the opportunity to be here and to talk to you a bit about my most recent book. and to thank Dr. Thayse Lima for accepting to moderate the debate and to talk a bit about the book later on. And I would like to start with a few words about the Brazilian elections. Those of you who are even a bit interested in Brazil probably have followed the elections that took place this last Sunday. And I think in the context of those elections, it becomes more important than ever to reflect upon Utopia and the two candidates who will face each other in the second round of the elections at the end of the month, Jair Bolsonaro and Fernando Haddad. They both, of course, as you know, present two almost diametrically opposed views of Brazil. One, a very nationalistic and tradition-oriented and even authoritarian vision of the country, and the other one, the dream of a kind of a more egalitarian Brazil that would be more open to external influences. But I would argue that both candidates go back to some of the utopian themes that have shaped the history of Brazil and Brazilian thought throughout the centuries. And just as an example, Bolsonaro draws heavily on the messianic tradition that I discuss in the book. I don't know if all of you know, but his middle name is actually the Portuguese for Messiah, Messias. And he often presents himself as this savior who is going to come and lead the country to a golden age of security and of stability, even if this comes at the cost of embracing past racial and gender hierarchies, and of course of cementing some of the economic disparities that have plagued Brazil. Haddad's platform, on the other hand, goes back to the promise of socio-political and economic justice that has been one of the key tenets of Brazilian utopianism, as I discussed them in the book. And so, even though they are both very different, both of these candidates go back to utopian ideas of Brazil that I think we need to really analyze in order to understand what is going on today in the country. And so the idea to write this book arose precisely from this reflection that Brazil has, throughout the centuries, been a repository for utopian aspirations. And so that was the goal of my project, to kind of go back to these utopian aspirations that have shaped what Brazil is today. An example of this is Thomas More's book Utopia, and you have there a copy of, I believe, is the first edition of Thomas More's Utopia from 1516. And in this book, in Thomas More's Utopia, of course, the word utopia was coined, right? And in this book, Thomas More, a British writer, he imagines an island that would be more perfect than the England of his time. And news of this island supposedly was brought to Thomas More by a Portuguese sailor called Raphael. And you can see here that he's alluding to the Portuguese voyages to Africa, to Asia, and especially to the Americas, right? This is a map of course, fictional map of the fictional island of Utopia from the end of the 16th century, based upon Thomas More's book, right? So More, he never really specified the coordinates of his imaginary island of Utopia, but he did write that it was located somewhere in the New World. And given that it was first visited by a Portuguese sailor, we can imagine that maybe More had the land that is now Brazil in mind when he wrote about this island of Utopia, right? The utopian drive became part of Brazil's cultural and intellectual DNA. From the arrival of the first Portuguese sailors and settlers onwards, the region's environment was often compared to paradise because it was so lush and bountiful. And even Brazil's pre-Columbian inhabitants were at first regarded as very amicable and friendly. Of course, this perception then changed as colonization progressed. But early Brazil was seen by European explorers as utopia realized. This is a painting called The First Mass in Brazil by a painter from the Romantic period. I think it's from 1861, this painting. And the painter is Victor Meirelles. And you can see here some of the things I'm talking about. So the lush environment, the large trees. You have, of course, the religious element. You have the soldiers also there. And then you have in the foreground the native Brazilian population, which they look on with interest and without any sort of animosity at the colonizers, right? One of the most powerful utopian forces that really led settlers, that led settlers to establish themselves in Brazil in the beginning was, of course, an economic reason, right? Brazil at first, there was lots of money made through the selling of sugar produced in Brazil in Europe. So sugarcane plantations were the first large-scale economic practice in Brazil. Then there was the gold rush in Brazil, which was another seen as an easy path to enrichment, right? So again, this utopian idea that if you go to Brazil, you'll get money easily and you'll get rich easily. This is a picture from the 1980s by Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado. And so mining continues to be an important activity in Brazil to this day. This is in Serra Pelada, which is in the southern part of Pará, so in the northern area of Brazil. And then another moment where there was this idea of easy enrichment in Brazil was the so-called rubber boom in the Amazon in the late 19th, early 20th century, where the sale of latex in Europe, because rubber was needed to produce, among other things, tires for cars. And so people extracted latex from the rubber trees in the Amazon, and that created prodigious wealth in the Amazon region, right? So my point is that at various moments in its history, Brazil was seen as a kind of El Dorado, where you could just go and get rich very easily without too much work. But these economic considerations, I think, do not exhaust the utopian aura of Brazil. The idea that Brazil is an economic El Dorado goes hand in hand with the idea that also sociopolitically, Brazil can point the way to the future. There is an Austrian author called Stefan Zweig, who titled his book from the 1940s precisely Brazil, a Country of the Future. And in this book, which we also have there for you to see afterwards, he contrasts the racism that was prevalent in Europe at the time he was writing during the Second World War. And so he contrasts the situation in Europe that was engulfed in racial bigotry with the situation in Brazil that he sees as the prototype for human relations in the rest of the globe. Of course, he might have a somewhat rosy picture of what Brazil was, but he believed that the country, and this is a quote from his book, is destined to become one of the most important factors in the future development of our world. And he continues by writing about Brazil, I knew that I had glimpsed the future of our world. And he says, Brazil gave me the feeling of living in a process of becoming in what is to come in the future. And so this idea of Brazil as being a country of the future that points the way to how our future might look like remains to this day, and I think became very much a part of the country's identity. To this day, Brazilian politicians, economists, scholars, and so on, speculate about whether the country will be able to live up to its promise of being a country of the future or not. And this is very much at play also in the electoral race, in the rhetoric of both candidates. So in States of Grace, in this book that I've just published, I traced how this idea of Brazil as a utopian land was reworked by Brazilian intellectuals at various moments in the country's history. And my first step were the messianic writings of Jesuit priest Antônio Vieira, whom you can see here, preaching to Brazilian Indians, pointing, of course, to heaven, right? Which is, it's very interesting that, of course, the indigenous population is seen as close to the ground, and they have to somehow rise up spiritually in the direction of heaven, right? So this was my first step in the book. And the utopian moment in his writings is that he believed that the colonization of Brazil was the first, not the colonization and the evangelization, so the Christianization of Brazil was going to be the first step in the Christianization of the entire world. And this conversion of the entire world to Catholicism would herald the second coming of Christ, who would establish a millenarian kingdom of peace on earth. So you can see the utopian undertones of his thought here. Another moment I explored in the book was the perception of the Amazon, and you have here a beautiful image of the Amazon during the time of the flood, when the river is very full, right? And so the Amazon has also been perceived as a utopian space, both by Brazilians and by foreign explorers who project onto the Amazon their ideas of social and political justice. I also discussed in the book the close relationship between Brazilian culture and the environment as a source of utopianism. Brazil, as you all know, is rightly so associated to biodiversity, and Brazilian writers have often imagined alternative relationships to animals and plants that would not be predicated on just exploitation. And then a final topic I discussed in the book was the conception of Brazil as a society of leisure. And while colonizers often criticized the work ethics of native Brazilians, Brazilian intellectuals have come to imagine leisure and even laziness as a positive Brazilian trait that distinguishes Brazil from other countries in Europe and in North America. And according to this view of Brazil, the country's laziness or leisurely way of life heralds a future time when machines will do all the work and we will be able to devote ourselves to leisurely pursuits such as, for instance, artistic pursuits, right? This is a clip from a 1969 film titled Mucuna EEMA by Joaquim Pedro de Andrade. And Mucuna EEMA, who is said to be the hero of Brazil, the hero of our people, as it says, as it is said in the book, he was defined by his laziness. He was extremely lazy, didn't like to work at all. And here you see him lying in a hammock where he spends a lot of time. And the film is in and of itself a rework of a novel published in 1928 by Mário de Andrade, a modernist writer, also called Mucuna EEMA. And also in the novel, Mucuna EEMA is extremely lazy and has his brothers do most of the work. And this is again perceived as something positive, so it's not criticized in the book. It's seen as a positive trait And it's almost as if Brazilian intellectuals were embracing a criticism that is often leveled against Brazilians, right? That Brazilians are lazy, they don't like doing too much work. And so these intellectuals were saying, yes, but this is a good thing that we resist doing work that in fact leads nowhere, right? So this is another moment of utopianism that I explored in the book. So positing Brazil as this country of the future, as some of these utopias do, creates a kind of a gap between Brazil's present reality as a country that has a certain set of limitations and the utopian expectations that we place upon Brazil. And this we could call it even a cognitive dissonance between reality as it is and reality as we would like it to be, creates a problem that Brazilians respond to, I would think, in two different ways. On the one hand, the significance of utopia for Brazilian identity contributes to what has been called ufanista attitude. Ufanista means just proud or self-congratulatory. And so often if you espouse this attitude, you tend to disregard Brazil's problems and to believe that Brazil is the greatest nation on earth, surpassing even the wildest utopian expectations. This is the main argument of a book titled Why I Am Proud of My Country, in Portuguese, Porque me ufano do meu país, published in 1900. And in this book by Afonso Celso, the author really just lavishes praise on Brazil as the greatest country on earth, and it's as if Brazil is really utopia realized. And this mindset has resurfaced at several moments in Brazil's cultural history. For instance, during the period of Modernism, which I already talked about, some of the factions that emerged during this period, they really had a radically nationalistic, ufanista agenda that advocated the superiority of Brazilian values and of the Brazilian way of being in the world. This segment of modernism was associated with far-right political movements such as integralism, and this is a picture of Brazilian integralists demonstrating. And then some of these values of integralism then fed into the nationalism of Getúlio Vargas' totalitarian new state in the late 1930s and 1940s. And again, the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil between 64 and 85 went back to some of these ufanista values, singing the glory of the Brazilian nation. And I would argue, to a certain extent, current candidate for Brazilian presidency, Jair Bolsonaro, also goes back to some of these ideas of ufanismo, praising a certain version of what Brazil is, as opposed to a more, let's say, horizontal view of what the country could be. So I'm not saying that nationalism and allegiance to one's country is necessarily something negative, but this excessively nationalistic, ufanista attitude often entails a racist posture, and its ultranationalism and its exaltation of Brazilianness often goes hand in hand with a debasement of other nations and cultures, and even of certain groups within the Brazilian nation, such as Afro-Brazilians. Right? So this is one of the paths that utopia can follow in Brazil. So this cognitive dissonance between the way things are and the way things could be can lead to this over-nationalistic attitude. The other attitude it can produce, this disparity between how things are and how we would like them to be, is an excessively critical and even fatalistic view of Brazil, according to which Brazil permanently falls short of one's expectations, right? At a very mundane level in Brazil, and those of you who know a bit about Brazil, remember that Brazilians keep referring to the exterior, to the countries that are outside, as if they were much better than Brazil. And so Brazil always compares negatively to other countries, right? And the root of this self-debasement lies in an interpretation of Brazil as plagued by a kind of fundamental deficiency. And this deficiency has been identified by different intellectuals differently. It can be racism, it can be the profound inequality that plagues the country, it can be corruption, for instance. I have here a cartoon that says, either Brazil finishes corrupt people, or corrupt people will finish Brazil. And so you have all of the corrupt people eating away at Brazil. And again, corruption was a key issue in this Sunday's elections, and will be a key issue in the second round as well, right? So while one is justified, of course, in identifying the shortcomings of Brazil or of any other country, many of these shortcomings that Brazilian intellectuals identify as a shortcoming of their country, they are not problems of Brazil alone. I mean, they exist in most countries in the world. And so I would argue that they do not warrant this permanent feeling of inadequacy of Brazil when compared to its utopian potential, nor do they condemn Brazil to somehow lag behind and not be a better version of itself, right? And as we know, this critical impulse was part of Utopia from the beginning. That's why Thomas More wrote his book, Utopia, was to criticize the England of his time and to show how it could be a better country. So to conclude, and then I would like to hear a bit from you, but to conclude, in States of Grace, I try to show that Utopia determined Brazilian history from the beginning, and that it is and will probably remain a central element in Brazil's collective identity. And as I was discussing just now, the very nature of Utopia is to create this gap between what is and what could be, between reality and a better version of reality, right? And Brazilian intellectuals have responded to this tension that is part of utopianism by hovering between the two extremes of exalted nationalism and excessive criticism of their country. And I think that by giving in to either of these tendencies, Brazil risks never really embracing the present and never really fulfilling its utopian potential. I think these two tendencies, this excessive nationalism and this fatalistic criticism, are easy responses to utopianism that fail to meet the challenge of utopia, because in one way or the other, they end up subscribing to the current state of affairs, either because it's already great or because it cannot be changed, right? So both of these tendencies lead us to stay the way we are, so they do not prompt us to change anything. So I think that Brazil should reject these two paths of excessive nationalism or excessive criticism, and continue to be open to the utopian possibilities that are woven into the very fabric of the nation's culture. As Brazilians prepare to vote in the second round of elections in the end of October, I hope that they will steer clear of both this over-nationalistic attitudes and also of a defeatist stance that only foregrounds the negative aspects in Brazilian culture. The ultra-conservative right, represented by Jair Bolsonaro, I think has been able to capitalize very well both on the extreme nationalist ufanista sentiment and on a defeatist outlook of an electorate that is really tired of corruption scandals and of social violence. So Bolsonaro has been, I think, very savvy in capitalizing on both of these attitudes. He, of course, always presents himself with the background of the Brazilian national flag or dressed in the Brazilian national colors, again, in line with what I was talking about, this overtly nationalistic posture. It remains to be seen whether the left, represented by Fernando Haddad, can mobilize another more constructive version of Brazilian utopianism, one that would be predicated on social and economic justice and on environmental harmony as a path for Brazil to live up to its utopian promise. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the library and Thalia and also Patricia for inviting me to discuss the book. Personally, it's been a pleasure to read the book because I've been wrapped around writing my own book, so it's good to read somebody else's thoughts and ideas. On the other hand, on the current context in Brazil, which is, to say the least, is scary, it was also refreshing to have contact with a book that is discussing something positive for change, which is utopians, even though we know that, and I think that that's what, from a scholarly perspective, is also very interesting from your book, is that you refrain from discussing negative utopias, and you also disagree with the idea that utopians will necessarily lead into totalitarian systems. So that has been refreshing as well, because I think that very often we read books that take a different position, which are necessary and important to take a critical position in relation to certain projects, right? So certain national projects in some ways to imagine the country. But I think that the other way around has been discussed and done to exhaustion. And so I found the book very original and very refreshing to read. So I'm very glad that I was invited for this. So I think we were going to start with a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open for everybody else. One of the things that I found really interesting and new to the book that I was talking to you before earlier on today was that even though some of these projects that you discuss are known and somewhat discussed, they were never organized around the idea of utopia, which I found it was almost this obvious thing that was in front of us, that this is permeating Brazilian history, Brazilian intellectual history, but was never discussed as such, organized as such, and I found it very interesting. So as you were explaining to everybody, there is a lot of utopian streaks that run through Brazilian history, and some of them are related to nature, some of them are political, some of them are cultural, there are messianic ones, and that is something that I found quite new. I never really thought about our intellectual history through these lenses. So one of the questions that I have for you is that how you went about organizing. It's such a large theme, and it runs through such a, basically the whole history of Brazil ever since the discoveries. How did you go about selecting what you were going to have in the book and what you were not going to have in the book? And I will ask you the question that I asked you earlier on, which is I found it interesting, and I wanted to ask you, one of the biggest, I think the most discussed, at least nowadays, utopians, Brazilian utopians, and also a failed utopian, right, is the idea of racial democracy and lusotropicalism that Gilberto Freire was writing in the 1930s. Gilberto Freire is a Brazilian sociologist who wrote Casa Grande em Senzala, I think is translated as Masters and Slaves. Yeah, that's right. So I was wondering, I imagine that the reason is because it's been discussed to exhaustion lately. But I wanted you to talk a little bit more about this process of what going about selecting what you're going to put and what you're going to exclude from the book.
Okay, it's actually a very good question, and I struggled with what I was going to include for a long time. First of all, to the first half of the question, of course, this utopian streak is not something that is part only of Brazil, but it's really part of most American nations, because the idea was that Europeans would come to the New World, and this very concept of the world being new. Of course, it was not new, there were people here before, but the conception when the Europeans arrived with this, that they were arriving at a kind of a blank slate where they could start anew and avoid the mistakes that they had made in Europe. So the idea that they could create a better society in the New World, and the very publication of Thomas More's Utopia is indebted to this idea, because finally you had a new world where you could project all of these dreams of social, political, and economic emancipation that you could no longer think of in Europe, because Europe was so corrupt and decadent and so on. So the very concept of a new world is what made Utopia possible, and so Utopia became part of the makeup of American nations much more than it was of European nations. And in the case of Brazil, as you were saying, I think what struck me is that even though it's so much a part of Brazilian history, it hadn't been studied systematically. There were a few articles here and there about Utopia and especially utopias in Brazil, but there was not a systematic study of how Utopia had impacted Brazilian thought, and so that was what I tried to do. And I selected, I didn't want to study books that were utopias in the sense that they presented alternative visions of reality. That was not my main goal. My main goal was really to study utopian thought as it presented itself, either in literature or in books that were books of sociology, essays, and so on, and that had become key to thinking what Brazil is today. And so I went about studying this and selecting the key moments. I wanted key moments in Brazilian history that on the one hand would be representative of utopian thought in Brazil. So I needed to include messianism, for instance, as the root of utopian thinking in Brazil. So the theological base from which posterior utopias developed. So that was something that I knew had to be there. And then I tried to select other moments that would be representative. So I wanted to have one chapter on the environment as a utopia. So that was also for sure. The part on leisure, I was also absolutely sure I wanted to write about. Now, the issue of race could have been another chapter in the book, but as you mentioned, it's something that has been studied a lot in Brazil, and so I thought that I was not going to be able to say anything as new on utopia, on racial democracy, as I could say on other topics. So that's why I kind of bracketed it. I also didn't mention, as we were talking before, I could have written a chapter on the issue of the reworking of messianism in the beginning of the 20th century with Euclides da Cunha writing about this issue. But again, I decided against it because so much scholarship has been produced on this that in the end I thought I wouldn't be able to add anything very substantive to the topic. But so yes, I wanted to have key moments of utopianism in Brazil and how it has changed and evolved, especially in the 20th century. Yeah. So that was the rationale behind the choice of the chapters.
One more thing that after your presentation, I was thinking about what you just said, And how, obviously, but as I was reading the book, I couldn't help but to think about the moment that we are going on right now in Brazil. And I was really glad that you brought it up in your presentation. I was surprised, and I've never really thought about Bolsonaro representing somehow, like, or I've never really thought about how he brings back some of the utopias that you discussed, or representing or presenting some sort of utopian view for the Brazilians, because so much of what he says is associated with actually fear, and and he's running through this fear, and that's how he constructed his platform and his discourse. But it's certainly something refreshing. It made me think about something else. What it made me think about is that most of the times when you're talking about utopia, we think about, we're thinking with the intellectual elite of Brazil and their dreams of what the country could be, and their confrontation with the realities of it, right? That seems always to actually fall short, because these utopias are actually rethinking core problems of the country, which are inequality, racial injustice, and so on and so forth. So you always feel like it's falling short of fixing those problems, right? But as I was thinking about it, I was thinking I had to actually recheck my position on Bolsonaro, at least. Not on Bolsonaro, but on the people that are voting for him, because I think in light of what happened 2 days ago, 49 million people voted for him. You ask yourself what people are thinking. Like, they really condone these ideas? You know, are they really supportive of this, or it's actually what is moving them is something else? It's that they believe that somehow, disregarding all the violent threats that is coming from this candidate, he somewhat offers a view of the country that they actually think it's important and possible. So my question, I think, is it has to do with this disconnect, perhaps. And if you think that there is a disconnection between what the Brazilian elites imagine about Brazil, and I'm sorry, I will always go back to Gilberto Freire, because I think it's kind of like a poignant example of that. But you can see it in other ones as well. I mean, in the idea of coming together that you see in Mucuna EEMA, the ideas of community and a more egalitarian community, it's also there. So if there is a disconnect between the dreams of the elite and the dreams of the people out there, the ones that we are not studying or reading or having access to, it's more your opinion about it, I guess.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent there is a disconnect, but I think to a certain extent also the elites are responding to something that is in the country. Let me make this more concrete. In the case of the current elections, I don't think there is so much of a disconnect between Bolsonaro and the Brazilian elites. On the contrary, I think he really embodies many of the ideas that have been latent in Brazil throughout for centuries. Again, the fact that he presents himself as a savior of the country, who is going to bring stability, peace, prosperity, and so on. This was a discourse, a messianic discourse, that has been part of Brazil for centuries, and is described very well by Euclides da Cunha in the Backlands, when he talks about Antônio Conselheiro and why people voted for him. I mean, it's shocking, but people in many of the Brazilian slums, favelas, he won. So the people that are going to be more impacted by his policies are voting for him, exactly because he has been very clever at appropriating some of these cultural tropes, some of these cultural themes that are so much part of Brazilian history and of the way Brazilians think about themselves. And I think this is why he has been so successful. And on the other hand, he has also capitalized on this feeling of discontent that is also, as I was saying, also comes out of this idea that you're never able to live up to the utopian promise as a Brazilian person. And so you're always falling short And he has capitalized on this. He's saying, I'm going to overcome this. We will not fall short of Brazil's promise, but we will tackle these promises and we will overcome them, right? So I think he has been a very smart politician. I don't know if he has done this more or less without thinking, or if his team of advisors have really thought this through. But the fact of the matter is that he has used cultural elements that have been very prevalent in Brazilian thought, and he has used them to his advantage in a way that I think the left has been unable to do. And that's why he won. So it's not that he's the candidate of the elites and the people didn't vote for him. And no, the people actually voted for him. It was not just the Brazilian elite. So I think this division here it doesn't apply, because he has really been selected. I mean, if anything, there is a geographic imbalance, because I think the only reason, the region that did not vote for him was the Northeast, for historical reasons, Lula being very popular in the Northeast and so on.
I think I was thinking more about the enlightened mid-century elite and the dreams of the country coming together and being more egalitarian. And that's actually something that is lacking on his discourse. But I appreciate what you're saying about how he actually has conquered the support of the elites and some parts of the population that would be directly affected by what he's bringing to his candidacy. I don't know if we should open to questions now, or if I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions too. I have a lot of questions.
I have a question or two. Get the ball going. First, thank you for
Thank
this
you.
excellent presentation. And is it possible for me, when you're talking about this, not to think, for example, of the four wonderful Portuguese murals that we have in this Hispanic division, as also a representation of some sort of utopian image of, conquest, the bandeirantes, catecismo, and all those things. So that's fabulous. First, I have a curiosity about Clarice and the role that she plays in this utopian thought, and how do you use her book, particularly The Passion According to GH, that we have here in this place. I would like to hear your thoughts on it and how you present her in your book. And another one is, I wonder if in your studies for this book, you came across this idea of utopian thought coming from indigenous populations, right? Because we've heard of how Europeans sort of bring this idea of utopia with them, and then it's reworked through other moments by Brazilians themselves, Modernism, and later on, and even in the 19th century. But I'm wondering if in your studies, as a curiosity, you came across the concept of utopia coming from indigenous thought in this way.
Oh, great. Those are great questions. So first, about the utopia from sources that are not literature or essays and so on. Of course, perhaps the most obvious one would be the construction of Brasilia in the 1960s as this utopian moment of creating a space that would be completely new and modern. So again, this attempt of Brazil to catch up with the future, right? And Utopia Brasilia is very futuristic in its architecture, as those of you who know it can probably already imagine that the center of Brasilia as this attempt really to create a utopian space concretely, architecturally. Then Clarice Lispector, so I read her book through what I call interspecies literature, and this is my new project. I'm working on literature and the environment, and how we can think of literature as a space where we give voice to non-human beings, and how non-human beings, plants, animals impact literary literature and writings, and also cinema. And so that's how I try to read The Passion According to GH, how the animal in the story impacts the very writing of the story. Right? So that's through there. And about the in indigenous cultures, whether utopia is also part of Brazilian indigenous thought. And I haven't read too much anthropological studies, but there is the concept of the land without evil in Terra Sem Mal, in indigenous Brazilian thought, and I think throughout the Americas. And I forget, I don't know if any of you is an anthropologist, but there is even a group of Brazilian indigenous peoples who used to go on a pilgrimage every few years looking for this land without evil. So they were settled in a specific place, and they would just take off and go look for this land without evil that has been compared to the Christian paradise. And so the idea is present in indigenous thought. I mean, one might argue that utopia in and of itself is part of human culture, that in one form or another it might not be called utopia because other cultures might not have a name for this idea, which Western culture did not have a name for utopia until Thomas More published Utopia. But the idea of something better than the current state of affairs is very much a part of human cultures throughout. So it would not be surprising that it exists, in Native American thought, and of course in Asian literature. It's full of examples of what we call utopia in the West. So yeah. Any other questions, comments?
Well, I kind of had a question, but I want to make sure that if I ask it, I didn't misunderstand your first part of the lecture. So, and also I don't want to reiterate what you just asked, but you mentioned agriculture, or not agriculture, but environmentalism and the connection with mining and the rubber boom and this kind of view of now the Amazon is bringing us this vast amount of wealth. So how do we reconcile the forced labor that was brought upon by the rubber boom? At least my experience is studying Peru in the Amazon, and there was what would be tantamount to genocide because of the rubber boom. So how does this utopian narrative kind of reconcile itself with finding better purpose and a better society when it's paved the way with atrocity?
Right. Yeah, so what I was saying is that this utopian image of Brazil has been very much connected with natural resources that were very abundant in Brazil. Of course, no one ever reflected how those were going to be extracted, which was mostly by either slave labor or later forced labor. But so from a perspective of the outsiders who were going to colonize Brazil, this was one of the main attractions, that you could go to Brazil and just get wealthy very quickly because the country was just so rich in natural resources. So that was the utopian moment there. In the Amazon, more specifically, in my chapter about the Amazon, what I studied was really the myth of the Amazons, it's what gave the name Amazon to the Amazon. And these were just some female warriors from classical Greece who, when the first colonizers went to the Amazon, they thought that they saw these women there along the river, and so they gave the name, the River of the Amazons, to the Amazon, and that's where the name comes from. And so later on, in the beginning of the 20th century, this group of women there are several books of literature that present this group of women as a utopian society. And so there are stories such as, outsider enters the Amazon, gets lost, goes to the tribe of the Amazons and realizes that they live a great life where everyone is equal and people share the burden of work and so on. So they are presented as this utopian society that contrasts with the inequalities of the rest of Brazil, right? And so that's the utopian moment. And of course, this is located in the Amazon because it's that open space of possibility where anything can happen because it's just so huge. Yeah.
Then how, if the image of utopianism is egalitarianism and shared labor and that sort of thing, how do you then square that with authoritarian control?
I mean, how is he able to create this narrative? Is it simply just harkening back to the good old days, or, because I always thought it had to have this future goal. How is this leader able to square these, or does he not? Is this sort of an outside reading?
Yeah, no, I think you're right that there are different strands of utopianism in Brazil. So one of them is this egalitarian horizontal view of society that is present, for instance, in the conception of laziness and leisure. Brazil as a country that is able to provide for everyone, so people won't have to work and so on. So that's one strand. Now the messianic strands of utopianism, which comes directly from theology, always had an authoritarian streak to it. Even if we think about one of the most famous messianic real-life experiments in Brazil, which was described, I mentioned, by Euclides da Cunha in the Backlands, famous book, Os Sertões in Brazil, where he describes a community living in the backlands of Brazil. The leader of this community, Antônio Conselheiro, he was what we would call today really an authoritarian leader within this community, right? And so I think that Jair Bolsonaro harks back to that particular strand of utopian thought that goes back to the messianic tradition and to authoritarianism within the messianic tradition, right? And what I was suggesting is that I think he has been able to activate something that has been part of Brazilian culture for a very long time, which is this thinking of messianism and of a savior that will come and make everything right. And this savior often has authoritarian characteristics, I mean, historically. And so people tend to accept his authoritarianism because there are other examples in Brazilian history of this. And so he falls back onto something that already exists in the culture, and that's why I think he's so accepted and so popular, really. Well,
maybe we have time for one more question.
I do.
well, last one.
Last one. I think that I was talking to you about it, and I think I'm going to kind of recuperate some of your questions in a certain way. It was impossible for me to read a book about utopianism and not to think, not about necessarily negative utopia, which would be kind of like apocalyptical thoughts and right, and it would fall into nihilism, but mostly about this disconnect that you see between these dreams of a better, more egalitarian country, and the reality that these authors were themselves experiencing at the time that they were writing. And what is interesting is not only that, I understand that, and you make it very clear in the introduction that utopias are not necessarily meant to be to become a reality or to be put to work in actuality, at least not in the intellectual tradition that you're studying. They're supposed to work as a north, right, that we aspire to and that we are going towards. But recuperating what people are saying is, and especially if you're looking Brazil from the outside, it doesn't only feel like a disconnection between reality and thought and dreams, but it also seems that this very reality, or the dreams of this more utopian future, are sometimes trying to fix that reality, right? Trying to create like another, or to encompass that problem or that they're seeing in there, and to do something else with it. I think that it becomes really clear in the Utopians of Leisure, which is in a way a revolt against, right, or a protest against the imposition of the necessity of work, right? So I wonder if at any point when you're writing, these ideas were there with you, like thinking about
Yeah.
how this is, there is this contrast.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's, I think, the main criticism leveled against utopia, and the argument that utopia sometimes leads to authoritarianism goes back to that in order to achieve the utopian goal, anything goes. So you can do anything politically because you have a goal that you need to achieve. That was the problem, for instance, of communism as a system, a political system, that the ends justify the means, right? So when I was studying utopias in Brazil, I worked with a different notion of utopia that I called, in another book I co-edited a few years ago, existential utopia. And so by existential utopia, I mean utopia not as a goal that somehow hovers above and beyond society in the future, but as utopia as something that is embedded in everyday practices, right? And that's why, for instance, I think utopias related to the environment are so powerful, because the environment is something you encounter on an everyday basis. It's not something out there. And again, issues of leisure. People work every day, they experience labor every day, and so utopias of leisure are not something that somehow could exist in somewhere in a very distant future, but are something that speaks to our realities in the present. And I think that that's the only way that a concept such as the one of utopia can still be relevant today, is if we think about it as operative on an everyday basis, and not as something that we should really try to reach sometime in the future, and that ends up being almost oppressive in the present. So to the contrary, I think utopias should make us feel uncomfortable in the present, but in a good way, showing us that the present can be better, but not as some sort of an ideal that we always have to match and we can never match, but as a kind of making us slightly, how should I put this, slightly uncomfortable where we sit, knowing that we could be a bit better, right? So I think that's the kind of utopia that is valuable politically today, right? A utopia that makes us see that things could be better, but that doesn't dictate how they necessarily need to go and how you necessarily need to behave for them to be better, right?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Thayse.